Becoming the Beloved Community. So this is our second week talking about an Episcopal journey to racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. And last week we did a very quick and not very deep study of how racism has shown up in the Episcopal Church since the Episcopal Church's founding. And this week we're going to be looking at naming the dream and practicing the way. And it hit me yesterday when I was working on what I was going to say to you this morning, that this is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and we will be talking about his vision of the beloved community. And so I thought that was pretty appropriate. So I put out a glossary of terms on the tables, which is just for you to take with you if you'd like. Some of the words we used last week, and some of them we'll use this week. And I just think it's a really valuable resource as you continue to think about racism and anti-racism, to have a toolkit of vocabulary as you enter. So at this point, I hope that most of us are on the same page, that racism is something that we as Christians should be talking about, and should be talking about in the context of the church. And I just wanted to cover 4 of the words that are in that glossary. The first is institutional power. Institutional power is the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others, the ability to decide who will have access to resources, and the capacity to exercise control over others. I think the key to this definition is the ability or official authority. Sometimes this shows up in ways that it's sanctioned, and sometimes it just is the nature of our society and culture. We saw institutional power in our conversation last week when we were talking about how the clergy of the Episcopal Church were able to maintain segregation following emancipation and in the civil rights era. The next term is oppression. And oppression comes out of institutional power and also contributes to institutional power. It's a system of individual, institutional, and cultural beliefs and practices that privilege a dominant group at the expense of the subordinate group. Systematic devaluing, undermining, marginalizing, and disadvantaging of certain social identities in contrast to the privileged norm. Oppression leads into internalized oppression, the process by which a member of a systematically oppressed group internalizes or comes to believe and act out of the prejudices and stereotypes attributed to that group. And all of that is wrapped up in a system of oppression in which conscious and unconscious, non-random and organized harassment, exploitation, discrimination, prejudice, and other forms of unequal treatment. This is the way that all of racism and racist belief and behavior gets wrapped up into a way of maintaining control in a society. So these 4 terms hopefully will help to frame our conversation, and we're going to move into thinking about what is the beloved community. How many people have heard this phrase before, beloved community? So this was a concept or a phrase coined by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it's defined as a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace and justice will prevail over war and military conflict. It sounds to me a lot like what we in the church talk about as the kingdom of God. And I think an important point, which is not totally captured in this, this comes from the King Center's website, and it's not totally captured, but this isn't saying that there is no conflict, right? This isn't saying that everyone is peaceful all the time and everyone agrees. But the way in which we go about dealing with conflict and the way that we go about dealing with disagreement is driven by love and by a seeking of peace rather than by fear and hatred. So, in this program, which has been put forward by the Episcopal Church, Becoming Beloved Community, we take this concept of beloved community as the goal which we are trying to seek through our community as the church. And so what we are tasked with learning is how to become this beloved community. And in order to do so, we must practice, right? So we talked a lot about how racism shows up. I'm sure all of us in this room could name situations in which we have experienced racism. I'm sure we could also name ways in which we've experienced beloved community, a true sense of love and community. But just as with any sort of thing which we are seeking to attain, we have to practice and put work into where we are trying to get. And so I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about what are some really practical ways that we can address racism and seek to become beloved community. I know a lot of times we get overwhelmed by what we see as suffering or hatred in the world, and it can be sort of freezing, and we don't know what we should do or how to even get involved. These 5 points were distilled from an article called 30 Ways to Be a Better Ally, and we're just going to walk through them. So the ways in which I'm suggesting we could practice the way of love as beloved community is to show up, to seek to educate ourselves, to self-reflect, to engage more with people who share our own identities, and that, yes, we need to acknowledge that we're not going to be good at this right away, right? We're going to do something wrong. So showing up means showing up to events which happen in our community that have to deal with racism, right? So going to the MLK marches or protests, going to be part of dialogues. The public library just showed I'm Not Your Negro and held a discussion afterwards. So showing up to events which are inviting the community to reflect on racism. And when we show up to these events, stepping out of the spotlight. So if the event is a conversation about some identity which is not your own, to let someone else who actually lives in that identity take the floor. So deferring to those people whose identities are centered as part of the event. Showing up involves listening more and talking less, considering who else is in the room and who is listening to you. A conversation about race is going to look very different with a room full of white people than it is with a room of people of different races and also people of particular races of color. And the last thing about showing up that I'll share is looking to amplify rather than overshadow. So a lot of times we're opinionated. I'm a very opinionated person, and there are some times when I share that opinion. But when it comes to showing up for anti-racism work, listening and amplifying what is being said by the people who are victims of oppression, rather than saying, well, this is what I believe, listening to what people are sharing with you, and then trying to share that message with people who might need to hear it. Seeking to educate yourself, just spending time looking at different resources or different articles, journals, books, watching movies. that have a different viewpoint from you or have a viewpoint that you want to explore more deeply. Following our first series of Becoming Beloved Community, a group of us decided that we wanted to work on building our competency around racism and anti-racism. And we've been meeting for several months, and we're all just reading different articles, watching videos, and we come together and just say, what's something that you've learned? And we share that with each other. Another thing that is simple to do to educate yourself is to diversify your media consumption. And this isn't just about like what news channel you decide to watch, right? So are you watching movies in which the primary characters are people of color? Or are you listening to talk radio that comes from a perspective that is different from your own? Self-reflection involves thinking about, why am I even interested in learning more about anti-racism? Why do I want to try and change the way the world is? Why do I want to be an ally? It also involves checking our subconscious or semi-conscious behavior. So it's really easy to say, like, I'm anti-racist and I want to be an ally. But we've lived our whole lives with a set of assumptions that are really difficult to unlearn. And so it's really unrealistic to expect ourselves to decide to do something and then just do it. I still fall into stereotyped thinking, but the importance is to recognize when that happens and to reflect on why it is that that happens, and then to try and change that in the future. And another way of self-reflection is thinking about the type of language that you use. So striving to use more inclusive language. The fourth point, engaging more people who share your identity. This means it's really not appropriate for me to go into a room of people of color and explain how racism works, right? But I can go to my white friends and explain, because I'm white, what I've learned about racism, or invite them into conversation and dialogue. And so the engaging more people who share your own identity is about inviting other people who maybe have not thought about how this is an issue that we need to consider, inviting them into thinking about it. And the last piece is just that racism and anti-racism work is really challenging and really complicated. And it's really easy to just say, I don't want to do that because I'm going to do something wrong. I'm going to offend someone, or I'm going to say the wrong thing and I'm going to look like an idiot, or someone's going to think that I'm racist because I didn't know what was the right thing to say. Those things are all reality, but we shouldn't let them hold us back from pursuing the work of anti-racism. So we must be vulnerable and move into brave space and say, this is something that I think is worth doing, even though I know that I'm going to do it wrong at some points. It's important enough to me that I am going to do it anyways. Does anyone have questions on what we've talked about so far, or things to add before we move on? I'm going to bring you the microphone.
I guess just being in such a diverse community, just this week it happened to me in my community. I come from New Jersey, so it's a big melting pot. I also consider where we are, it happens with even Muslims here, and we had a Muslim move into my community, and he's a really sweet guy, Ahmed. He's much older, and a lot of people were just avoiding him because he talks different, he looks different. I think maybe we should look further than outward appearance, just like we, I don't know if that's an easy way to say it. Maybe it's easier to say it than it is to do it for some people. but that was how I was brought up. You don't look at people at the outside.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions to share before we move on? So we use this phrase in our confession every week during church. Forgive us for the things that we have done and for the things that we have left undone. This leads us to an understanding that there are ways in which we actively choose to do things which are sinful, and we also choose to not do things which are sinful, or we participate in things without being intentional about it and contribute to the sin of the world. And so I want to invite you with your table, and if you are sitting alone, to maybe go find someone to talk to at a table with another person on the following questions. How has St. Paul's shown up as the face of Christ or the presence of God's love in response to racism in the past? And how has St. Paul's failed to show up as the face of Christ or the presence of God's love in response to racism? So both, what have we done to show up for racism, and also what have we missed the opportunity to show up? So I hear a lot of stories about St. Paul's participation in the Black Lives Matter vigil and that sort of thing. And I also know that we did not do an adequate response to the acts in Charlottesville, right? So it's not that we are always on the side of good or always on the side of bad, but we're complicated. And so I want to invite you into thinking about how have we shown up and how have we not? And then what might we do to work to show up in the future, okay? So we'll take a little bit of time to discuss as a group, and then we'll come back together to share any insights that we had. So in case you've run out of things to say at this point, I invite you to think about how have you personally shown up as a follower of Jesus in the face of racism, and how have you failed to show up in the face of racism? So if you've run out of things to say about St. Paul's, you can also talk about yourself, and then we'll get back together in about 5 more minutes. So let's come back together for one large conversation, and I wonder if anyone has something that they feel called to share with the large group. Doesn't necessarily have to be your personal story about how you've succeeded or failed in the face of racism, but maybe something that came out of your conversation. Does anyone want to say something about how we as a community have shown up in the face of racism or failed to show up in the face of racism? Or maybe what it feels like to show up or not show up?
I'll say something that came up at our table. St. Paul's is a welcoming place at which very few people of color seem to actually feel welcome. That's not actually what we said here, but that's sort of what was. But it's a place that has left undone the task of inviting people in a way that they'll be accepting of, and that's undone.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, reflections? Well, I hope that you found something helpful in the conversation that you had. And we're going to move into another conversation, which is a thought exercise. So I'm going to come around with these worksheets, and pencil. Can someone help me pass out stuff? Thank you. So on the worksheets, there's some situations and then 2 columns. One invites you, what would you personally do in response to this? And the other is, what might the church do in response to this? And you can either work through this on your own or as your table or just talk about it. But the situations are, you find racist graffiti in your neighborhood, or perhaps you find racist graffiti on your church welcoming sign, which is something that happened following Charlottesville to an Episcopal church. The second situation is there's a white supremacist rally to be held in your city. The third is you see a racist comment is posted on Facebook. The fourth is nobody says anything about the latest racist event. Or perhaps somebody says something that you don't feel is enough to be said. And then we have 3 which are more broad. How might you respond or the church respond to racism in the criminal justice system, in immigration, or in education? And so I don't expect you to fill out the whole worksheet, or it's not going to be graded, but I hope that it invites you to thinking proactively about what am I going to do? Because a lot of times, pencil? Okay, a lot of times we are faced with things in the moment, and I know a lot of times I don't know what to do, but it helps me if I've thought about it ahead of time to say, what would I do? We know that these things happen. We know these are realities in the world. And if it were to happen to me or to happen in my community, what would I do? So if you have questions or comments, I'm happy to come around and help. But we'll spend the rest of our time together in conversation with each other or working through this thought exercise. So at about 10:45, we'll say a closing prayer. Otherwise, let's do this work together.